Linting our code bases is the start of really good code hygiene. And in this video, we're going to talk about linting from end to end. So not only will we have eslint set up inside of our editor in our code base, we'll also set it up so that our code will lint on save and we'll lint before we commit with some pre-commit hooks. We'll even take it a step further so that whenever we make a pull request to our repo, the linter is run there just to make sure the code is in a good state before we merge it in. In this video, I'm going to show you how to set all of that up. So let's get started. My name is CJ. Welcome to Syntax. So for this example, we're just going to start up a Vite and React app. If you head to the Vite site, they have a command we can run. I'm going to use pnpm and we'll set up a new Vite app. I'm going to call this my Vite React lint example, and we'll choose React. We'll also choose TypeScript. Now let's head into that directory and then install dependencies. Now, if we open this up with VS Code, you can see we have our default Vite and React project here, and it actually comes generated with an eslint-config. And this has all of the defaults and recommended rules that you would want for working with React. But I like to take this one step further. So there are various lint rules that I like to enable, and also some plugins I like to add, and some stylistic rules that I like to enable as well. Now, you could set all of this up from scratch, and your config file would start to get very lengthy, but I actually like to use a tool from antfu called eslint-config. And this is essentially a pre-configured eslint-config that has a bunch of plugins already enabled, so you can just change the settings if you'd like to use them. I use this for every single one of my projects, so much so that I actually have a default antfu config with all of my preferred settings and plugin rules. So this is what I'm going to enable here. I'll first add it as a dev dependency, and then I'm going to grab my pre-configured settings here and then update my eslint config. Now I'm going to rename this .mjs so that it behaves as a module, and I'm actually going to replace the entire existing eslint config. And because this is a React app, antfu's eslint config has a React option, and we can set that to true. Now, if we open up the eslint output channel, you should see that antfu is trying to install various plugins, and it's not going to be able to do that inside of VS Code. So what we'll do is run the linter, and that should prompt us to install those plugins. And if we look in our package.json, it comes pre-configured with this lint task. So from the command line, if I do pnpm lint, it should prompt me to install these plugins. Awesome. And now with those new antfu settings, we actually run into a lot of linter errors. And so if we look at our package.json, we now have all of the plugins that config requires, including these React plugins. Now, another thing I like to enable is lint on save. And if you head to antfu's repo, he actually has some settings that we can use. If you check out VS Code support, these are settings we can add to our settings.json file that have some sensible defaults. So it enables lint on save. So anytime I save my file, it automatically applies the linter. And this config is actually using eslint stylistic. So these are essentially formatting rules that give you a similar experience to, let's say, Prettier, but it's actually just built in directly to eslint. And in the FAQs of his repo here, he has this link to a blog post called Why I Don't Use Prettier. And he kind of talks about the limitations of Prettier. And one of the main things is he doesn't like the automatic line wrapping because it creates a lot of noise in pull requests. So eslint stylistic can still format your code in that way, but it has some more sensible defaults, so it's not changing a bunch of code based on print width. And the other thing is typically if you are using Prettier, you have to find some kind of plugin that make eslint and Prettier work together. So I prefer just to use eslint with eslint stylistic like antfu has set up. Now to get all of these settings, we're just going to copy this settings file here. And inside of VS Code, we'll create a folder called .vscode and create a settings.json inside of there. And you'll notice that this disables Prettier. So even if you have the Prettier extension installed, inside of this project, we don't want to use it. We're only going to be using eslint. And like I said, this does lint on save. Now, another thing that this enables is some sensible defaults because it won't show linter errors for some of those stylistic rules. So if you're missing a semicolon or your white space is off, typically, you don't want to see a red squiggly under those things, especially because they're going to be fixed on save. So this disables all of that so you don't have too much noise inside of your editor. We also enable the linter for all of the supported file types, and these settings are great. So if I just do a reload of VS Code, and let's say we head into our main.tsx, you'll notice we do have a linter rule because there's some import sorting rules built into his config. But if we save, it automatically adds all of our stylistic settings as well. So it added semicolons, changed to double quotes, and you can see it sorted the imports here. So antfu's config is really great. I highly recommend you check out his documentation and go modify his config to your heart's content. These are my preferred settings, but you might have some other preferred editor settings. But his config is flexible enough that it can be enabled or disabled for all of your preferences. Now, looking at some of the rules that I like to enable, I actually add this setting here for sort imports, because if you're using TypeScript with aliased imports, that setting is needed so that way they're sorted in the right order. And then I also like to restrict file name casing. So I want to make sure that every file in my code base is using kebab case. So next, let's actually just lint our whole project. Because it was generating using different style settings, we should apply our current style settings to everything. So in our package.json, let's add a lint fix command that also fixes all the auto-fixable problems. You'll notice that because I enabled formatters with antfu's config, it also is trying to format this JSON file. So the moment I save it, it sorts the properties here in the JSON file according to that rule. Now let's run lint fix, so it'll fix all of the auto-fixable things in our code base. So it fixed most things, but you can see because I have that file name casing rule, it's erroring out for our app files because they're not using kebab case. So I actually need to rename these to be lowercase, and yeah, the import was updated. I just need to reload VS Code to make sure that it can detect the casing name change. And with that, we should be good. It looks like we have some warnings. Yeah, but these warnings are good because, I mean, it is just the default React app, but I'm going to go ahead and add this rel here on any of the links to get rid of that warning. And then we're also missing the type attribute on our button component. Yeah, so we can just give this a type of button. So if we run our linter again, we should be good to go. So that's it for the first step of getting linting end to end. Configure your linter, enable all of your rules, and then also make sure you have VS Code integration. Next up, we're going to set up pre-commit hooks. So right now, this isn't a Git repo, but if we init it and then stage all of our files, one thing I like to do is run the linter before allowing a commit to happen. Now, there's some controversy around whether or not you should enable this. It can be disabled for one-off commits, and I really like it because I don't want to have to wait for my CI server to tell me that my code isn't passing linting. So I want it to catch that before I actually push up to GitHub. So let's enable that now. For this, we're going to use a tool called Husky, and it essentially just configures our pre-commit hooks for us. We'll use the command here to install it with pnpm, and then we can run init, and it will generate the .husky folder for us. So if we take a look at our editor, we now have this .husky folder, and there's this file in here called pre-commit. And this can list any command that you want to run before a commit happens. So by default, it's running this test command. We don't have any tests in this code base, but we actually want to run our linter before allowing us to commit. So if we do pnpm lint there, it'll run that every time before we commit. So let me actually just introduce a linter error. Like I'll remove the semicolon here. It's actually going to break because I have lint on save. So I'm going to disable lint on save and make sure that that semicolon doesn't exist. We'll stage everything. But now that we have this pre-commit hook, when I attempt to commit, it's going to run the linter first. So if we just try to commit this like so, it runs the linter first. And if the linter fails, it does not allow the commit to happen. So this is my preferred workflow. So that's great. Now, another thing we would like to do is only run the linter on files that have actually changed. So let me go ahead and get this committed. I'll push it up to GitHub, and then we can work on making sure that the linter only runs for the changed files instead of running against the whole code base. So our code's on GitHub now. I'm going to go ahead and check out a branch, and we're going to call this lint-staged setup. And the tool we're going to be using is called lint-staged. So right now, every time before we commit, it's going to run lint, and that runs across our entire code base. So you can imagine as this code base gets larger, this lint command is going to take longer and longer to run. What lint-staged does is it only looks at the files that have been staged for commit, and it will only run the linter for those specific stage files. You can also use it to only run test for your stage files. And this makes it so that if you only changed one file, you don't have to wait for the whole code base to lint. You just wait for that one changed file to lint. So we'll install this as a dev dependency. We'll do it with pnpm. And if you check their docs, they have a configuration section. Now, you can configure lint-staged with its own separate file, but you can also just add it to your package.json. And that's what I like to do because I don't want another config file hanging around. So you can take that config and then in your package.json, add it down here, and then specify the command you want to run. For our case, we want to run the lint command. So here we're going to say pnpm lint. And so now if we just want to test this, we can do pnpm exec lint-staged, and you'll see that right now we don't have any staged files. So let's actually do what we did earlier. Let's introduce a linting change, and let's say just like remove a semicolon here, and then we'll stage those files and now run exec lint-stage. And you'll see that it detects that there are only 3 changed files and then runs the linter on only those 3 files instead of the whole code base. And you can see we have a couple of warnings here. Let's just fix our whole code base. And then if we now stage the files that have been linted and then run lint-staged again, it should pass this time because we don't have any linter errors. Great. So now instead of running just lint for our commit hook, we actually want to run lint-staged. So if we head to our pre-commit file, instead of doing pnpm lint, we'll do pnpm exec lint-staged. And so now anytime before a commit, it's going to run lint-staged. So let's add all of this, and then we'll commit it. We'll say add lint-staged. And then before the commit, it's going to see we have files changed, run the linter on them, and then everything's good to go. So this is definitely something you're going to want to set up if you're using pre-commit hooks, because like I said, you don't want to have to run that linter on your whole code base before every single commit. Now, one more thing we can do is set up linting on a CI server. So anytime I make a pull request to this repo here, we can actually run the linter. And if there are any linting errors, that will actually show up in the pull request. And so whoever made that pull request will know that they need to fix their code. Now we're going to do this with GitHub Actions. If you head to the Actions page, they have a bunch of pre-configured actions you can use. We're just going to set it up from scratch because it's not too hard. If you head to their docs, there is a section called Building and Testing Node.js. Now we're in a React project, but when we run the build or when we run the linter, that's all using things inside of Node.js. So we're going to want to follow the instructions here for setting up a workflow with Node.js. They also have instructions for all kinds of other types of environments that you'd want to run it in. Now, one of the nice things is you actually can set up a matrix of versions. So if your GitHub workflow is maybe running tests, you could actually run tests against multiple versions of Node. We're just worried about a single version of Node, so we're going to copy this config right here. And then in our code base, we'll create a folder called .github. Inside the .github folder, we'll create a folder called workflows. And inside of there, I'll create lint.yaml. And now we'll get it set up. So the name here is just going to be lint. And this is going to run inside of a container. It'll run on an Ubuntu container. And you can see they have some stuff set up for us. So this actions/checkout will check out the latest version of our code. And then setup node will set up this container to run Node.js. And then we specify our node version here. Now this currently is saying use node version 20. I want to use the LTS or the long-term support version. The current LTS is version 22. And then our linter wants us to specify it like that. Now, after that, you can run any number of commands inside of this container. And for our purposes, we actually want to do a pnpm install. And then after pnpm dependencies have been installed, then we want to run pnpm lint. Now, in order to use pnpm in this action, we need to set up this container to have pnpm installed. If you check out the pnpm docs, there's a section here on continuous integration, and they show you how to set this up with GitHub Actions. They actually have a pre-configured action here that will install pnpm in the container that runs on the workflow. So I'm going to copy this section here and then just put it right above our Node.js setup. So now our container will have pnpm. So when we run install, that command will exist. Now, the other thing is we want to set this up to only run on pull requests. Right now, this will run on every push to the repo, but we want to set it up for pull requests to the main branch. If you check out their docs for triggering a workflow, you can see all the different types of scenarios that could potentially cause a GitHub action to run, like when a new issue is opened, or when you fork a repo, or when a label is created. There's a lot of different types of events. What we care about are filters, and you could do like when a push happens to a specific branch, but what we care about is pull requests. So when a pull request happens on the main branch, that's when we want to run our linter here. And so that should be the setting that we need. Now, typically in order to test this out, you would need to push it to GitHub and then see the action run and see if it actually works. But there's a way to run these GitHub actions locally. And that's with this tool called Act. So they have a lot of different ways to install it. I'm on a Mac, so I just used Homebrew to install it, and then we can use it to run these GitHub actions. Now, this is built on top of Docker because that's what's happening in the cloud with GitHub Actions. It's actually spinning up containers. So you'll need Docker running on your machine as well. But to test this out, we can use act pull request, and then it will run any actions that should run on pull request. Now, I have act installed locally, and I have Docker running in the background. So if I do act pull request, it will run any workflow that should respond to a pull request. Now, I have already run this before, so it's already has all the containers locally. The first time it runs, it'll take a little bit of time because it does have to download those containers. Now, we actually got an error that it can't find the package eslint plugin format. I thought we had this installed. Let's look at our package.json. Apparently we don't. But that's a good thing because we didn't have to push our code to GitHub to see that it was going to fail. So I'm going to install this as a dev dependency, and then we'll try running act again. Okay, we have a bunch of linter errors. Let's see why. And it's looking at files in this .pnpm store. Now, I don't know if this same folder will get created for GitHub Actions, but we should ignore this because if it does exist, we don't want to run our linter against it. So if we head into our lint-config, we can actually add an ignores section here, and we'll just put pnpm store/star. So ignore any file in that directory if it exists. So let's try running it again. So it worked, but I actually do have a linter error because I disabled lint on save earlier. So let's re-enable that and then save this file. That adds the trailing comma. We can run this again to make sure it's going to work. Great. So now I'm pretty confident that if I push this action up to GitHub, it should work as intended. So let's go ahead and add everything, and we'll make a commit, and lint-staged is going to run against those 4 staged files. It passed. We'll push this up to that branch and check to see if the linter runs on GitHub. We'll open up a new pull request against main. And if we give it a second, the linter should kick in. There it is. All right, moment of truth. Is it going to pass? And we have a successful build. So that's awesome. This is how I want things to exist. Any pull request to this repo, it's going to automatically run the linter. But let's test to see what happens if there is a linter error. Now, one of the things you can do is make a commit without running the git hooks. And really, this is one of the main complaints a lot of people have is like, I just want to commit whenever I want. I don't want to run the linter every time. With all of this enabled, you can still disable the pre-commit hooks. So if you just pass -in whenever you do a git commit, that will skip any hooks that could have run. You can also do --no verify. So let's do that right now, push up, and then see the linter fail on GitHub. So let's disable auto lint on save, remove a semicolon from somewhere. Okay, so let's commit this file that has a linter error. We'll say this should break, and we'll pass in -in for no verify. Look at that. Our pre-commit hooks did not run, and then I'll just push this up to that branch, and we should see a failing run over on the pull request. So the new commit was received. We'll see the previous one passed, and this one's running now. And it failed. Of course, we were expecting it to fail, but we were missing that semicolon. So now if I just fix all my codes, commit that, and then we'll say this should work. And because I didn't pass -in, it's going to run lint-staged, which was really fast because I only had one changed file. And then we can push this up. And again, that'll trigger another action run, and it passed. So that's great. And now we can actually merge this in. Now, one thing I like to do when merging in pull requests is to squash any commits that happened on the pull request. Because if we merge this in without squashing, all 4 of these commits would show up on the main branch. And if we look at the main branch, it only has 1 commit right now, which was our initial commit. And if I were to merge this in as is, we then have 4 commits. One of them is broken, and I want to keep the main commit history clean. So if we do a squash and merge, it's going to take all 4 of these commits, turn them into a single commit, and then on our main branch, we're only going to see that 1 commit that has all of these changes in it. So I'm going to do a squash and merge. That's great. Another good thing to do is when you're done with a branch on GitHub, go ahead and delete it so you don't have a bunch of stale branches hanging around. But now if we look at the main branch commit history, we just have those 2 commits. And if we look at this commit, this has all of the changes from that pull request, but nice and concise in a single commit. So I'm going to head back to the main branch, pull all those changes in. And one thing I noticed is that these GitHub settings are actually ignored by default. I actually like to commit these to my repo. So first of all, I'm going to re-enable lint on save, which actually got committed. And if we look in our git ignore, yeah, this is ignoring everything in the VS Code folder. I actually want this settings file to exist on GitHub. So when other people pull my repo down, they have all of these same editor settings. So I'm going to manually add that ignored file. You'll see that by default, it's like, hey, this is in your git ignore. Do you really want to do that? I do, because I want others to have my same VS Code settings. And so now this file will actually exist in the repo. So I'm going to commit this, and I'll just push directly up to the main branch. Awesome. So now we have full end-to-end linting. We're linting in our editor. We have lint on save. We're linting before a commit happens with lint-staged. And whenever a pull request happens, we're running the linter on our CI server. So that's it for this video, but if you enjoyed this, definitely leave a comment, leave any questions if you have them, and if you enjoyed this, definitely subscribe because I'll be publishing more videos soon where I'm actually working on a full stack application where I'm using this exact same flow. I show you how to work with GitHub issues and GitHub projects, set up your linter and lint-staged and everything in the same way, and just have a nice editor experience. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.